which is the last item on item 9. We've done the other 8 items while you've been away.
Executive decisions were made.
And Sir Tim did reflect that he was really pleased that he's not the only one that has trouble with new technology. So working our way through the agenda, we've got the minutes from the previous meeting, which are there for you to digest. Any issues arising from those?
No.
They'll come up on the agenda. There being none, would somebody like to move that they're accepted? Graham, thank you.
Oh.
Seconded by Bruce. All those in favour say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Thank you for your support. Moving on to the project update, and there's a paper there. Would you like to speak to that, Jane?
Yes, thank you, Nobby. I'll just speak briefly. You can see that the key thing on the agenda is the suggested approach to the legacy report. And we are also going to have a verbal update about the supporting the mayor group. I don't know whether you want to stop and have that now, or I can just keep going on a very brief summary and then we can work through it.
Well, it might be helpful for you to cover that issue of the 2 reports and the legacy report, because I know you and Bruce and Claire and others have had some background discussions about where that would go.
Yes, and in terms of the legacy report, I think I'm going to hand over to Bruce to give an update on where we've got to, given we've had the conversations as part of the qualitative review and the online review. I think Michael will tell you how many people have responded to that, and the question that was raised in our minds was whether we've actually got 2 reports, one on the 6-month wrap-up review and one on the legacy report. That's what we have indicated to date, but perhaps I hand over to Bruce, because he led the discussions with councillors and he gives you an update of where we think a sensible path forward with regard to concluding these things.
Yeah, thank you, Jane.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jane. In fact, as you speak, it just makes me realise that we're calling this a wrap-up report, but it's also a 6-month review. The reality of it is, having caught up with all councillors, Nobby, I'm glad to say, other than I think Peter, who's been indisposed, it's fair to say that what we have is the information that you need for the legacy report. In fact, when Jane and I sat down to collate the information that we've received from everybody, we're starting to write the legacy report. So I have suggested to Nobby, as chair of the PGG, that in fact we amend our approach and that we roll the wrap-up report and the legacy report into one. Because if you recall the nature of the questions that you've gone through with me, which was the 4 issues, or the 4 presenting issues when we started this process, the talk around the charter, communications, and indeed learnings from the whole, actually really the whole process, not just the last 6 months, we in effect have the material for the legacy report. So it seems crazy to produce a wrap-up report 1 month, produce a legacy report the next month. And I think, and I would want to recommend to the committee that you accept that Jane and I just go straight into a legacy report. Nobby, I'd like to suggest that we do that though, still to the May deadline.
Yep.
Okay, so not to bring the legacy report forward. Oh. What I thought would be useful is it would be good to have a workshop, and I'm suggesting either in place of or in conjunction with the April meeting of the PGG, to take councillors through their findings. Yep. Okay, I mean we have a lot actually, and a lot of really good stuff that has been expressed, and I think it would be useful if we could find some time. It doesn't have to be that day. If you want it earlier, I'd be happy to make it earlier as well, but I'm just suggesting that to workshop, as we have in the past, what those findings are, so that I can get in a workshop situation your views and advice about where that's going, and we can share where we think we're going with the legacy report. I just think it helps with the delivery, because the intention is, and Richard, I know you're there, and we've talked about this, the legacy report would form the basis of a letter to Richard suggesting that we've met the department's overall objectives of the total project.
Yep. So before I open that up, just a quick reflection. At the chairs group as well, we had some discussion yesterday, just brief discussion about where this committee or group would go. It was my view that I think the sooner we move past some of these milestones, the better. It's all very well to have support from external people like yourself and the two EAs and the DIA, but we are coming up to what I believe is 4 critical points. The first one is we've got annual rates to be considered, and we're workshopping that, and that will be contentious. We have the future of the museum project, which is another area that will have some debate internally, as well as some consultation externally. We have the annual plan, and then we get into the silly season just before the election. And I think if ever we want to show as a group of councillors that we can act professionally, now is the time to sort of take away the scaffolding, as it were, and see whether we fall over or not. I don't believe we will. Quite confident about that, because yesterday we had some tense issues up on the agenda around the museum, but we didn't get to any bloodletting or name calling, and we just worked through a process. And so for me, that was a time frame that we need to get to that space. April, May would be fine by me, as you suggested. The sooner we get the feedback from your area, I think that would be helpful, because people are quite excited to know what's come out of those interviews. And I'd be interested to hear from Michael how many applied, or how many took the time to fill in the quantitative survey.
Which is actually a good point. Sorry that I forgot, I didn't mention Michael's work, but it would be logical that the survey work also be sheeted into the total 101 report. Which would make sense.
Because I think there are different questions and different approaches in those two, between what you do.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that was always intended.
You might be able to help us, Michael, just on how many people.
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Chair. So there were, as of midday yesterday, 6 of the 13 had completed the survey.
Well, for the record, that's an outrageous result, to be quite honest. I mean, we've put a whole lot of effort and a whole lot of ratepayer money into getting this right, and for less than half the elected members to respond, it just staggers me, really, to be quite honest.
Mr. Chair, there might be an opportunity if you, as chair of PGG, were to email your colleagues today. The survey is still open. And perhaps you could encourage them to complete it with a view to its findings being included in Bruce's wrap-up and legacy.
So Michael, the deadline for the...
I believe it's this Friday, but I can confirm that.
I could see Jane wanting to say something.
I'll come back to Jane in just in a minute, please. If you could help me with an email just to let me know the deadline and who hasn't done it, I want it so I can specifically target the people.
I don't know that I can do that, but I will touch base with our provider and see what information they can give me.
Thank you for that. I'll certainly do the email, Claire. Jane.
I'd look just to say that if we have to leave it open for another couple of days, we will, because it's vital we get everybody's input. And last time we had to do a bit of cajoling towards the end as well.
We did.
So we'll keep on the case to make sure everybody has the opportunity to respond. It very much goes in tandem with the other survey. So we need these responses just as much as the other ones.
You are being generous, Jane, and your support there. I mean, Leslie reflected recently, and I did too. It didn't take long to do that quantitative survey. And I did prompt it with people to encourage them to do it. But I'll do another email today.
Could I just jump in there for a second? Sorry, Nobby. Just speaking to Jane's point, I'd be a little disappointed if we had to extend the time of the survey. I think an email from you is going to be really, really useful. But to extend the time of the survey is to support poor behaviour on the part of the councillors, and that's just, here we are trying to say that councillors turned a corner and yet they can't do a survey in time. So that would be a last resort. I agree we need to hear it from everybody, but I don't think we should extend the survey, especially if it's open till Friday. It's heaps of time.
Yep, and thanks for that, and I fully agree. You can gather by my comments how frustrated I am, and you're right. If we don't take the time to do it, it's a pretty poor reflection, really.
Mr. Chairman, I think we should look at the reason, if we can, as to why it's such a poor turnout. And I would suggest that it's such loaded questions, you can virtually guess what the outcome's going to be. And I think we should be prepared to look at why this is such a poor turnout.
Okay, so just in response to that, Your Worship, have you done the survey?
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. And I've done it too. And but the survey is couched in such a way that you've got a wide range of responses, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and 3 or 4 in between there. So they make statements, and you either agree or you don't agree. I found some of the questions difficult to assess. There were 3 or 4, and I raised before the survey that I felt uncomfortable about some of those questions. But we did discuss at the time that we looked to this quantitative survey again, that we wanted to keep the survey fairly relevant to the previous one, so that we're comparing apples with apples and not changing the survey, because that could be construed as you're changed into questions to suit the outcome. So yeah, and again, some of the questions I would have preferred not to answer, but for more than half the elected members not to respond, given the email I sent out encouraging it, without having the courtesy of coming back and saying why they weren't doing it, is a little bit difficult, I think. And Richard's response from the DIA is a clear steer for us. That's not a very positive picture going forward.
You could add it into your email.
Mr. Chair, if I can just come in there with a comment.
Yes, certainly, Leslie.
I would object strongly to a description of the questions as a loaded survey.
Yeah.
It's a very ordinary survey that, as you said, gives you the chance to have a range of agreement to a range of questions that we deliberately left as very similar to the original. So I think for anybody to describe it as a loaded survey is nonsense. It's a fair survey. It's a serious survey because we've been in a serious situation. I think the responsible thing to do was to keep it very similar, because obviously you're going to gauge the difference between the original and the now answers. But I do strongly object to anyone describing it as loaded. That connotation is not a responsible way of describing any of the process we're going through.
Certainly. And my perspective on that is I've been in the government sector for quite a few decades, as you know, and we've had these before, and although I found some of the questions confronting and would have preferred not to answer them, I didn't think it was the right way to go. By far the best surveys are the ones that give you a hard-hitting statement, and then you either agree or disagree, and you have some mandate in between. And not to belittle what we had in the communication survey yesterday, Lisa, so don't take offence to this, but when you do things in a more subjective way, and the wording's not clear, people start to interpret what does that actually mean. But the questions that were in that survey were quite blunt and quite confronting in some cases, and you either agreed or you didn't agree, or you got into the middle ground. And they did allow for some comments as well.
Cheer.
Certainly, Graham.
I'm wondering if I did the same survey, because I found it straightforward.
Yeah.
You even agreed to, as you said, there was a range of responses, and if you're open and honest about, and you were doing it in your own privacy, as a confidential survey, I thought it was straightforward. Yeah.
I think my comments were more about some of the questions I thought were a little bit difficult, and I think when we initially discussed it, there were about 4 or 5 questions that in an ideal world may have been taken out. But as you say, we want to compare apples with apples and see the progress.
And I wouldn't want to Nobby conflate quantitative and qualitative surveying, which is not my expertise. But as we've said, assuming that we've got we should have a proper turnout for Michael's good work around this survey. We do also have the qualitative statements, and one of the things that Jane and I are looking at and are keen to do is to make certain that the report reflects your comments about the results, not Jane's and mine. There will be analysis from Jane and I in terms of that legacy report, but first and foremost, it's to report how council are feeling. So I think, Tim, if there are issues that you have hinted at, quite frankly, I think all councillors took the opportunity, let alone have had the opportunity to get that free flow and get their view across, for which Jane and I will do our best to try and reflect also in the report. So we'll have both side by side, which should be helpful.
Well, I think that was really helpful that we had the two parallel processes, because it allowed, certainly in an interview I had, it allowed me to explore a few things that I wouldn't have been able to explore in the quantitative survey. So that just gives a bit of meat to the bone, as it were. Okay, Jane, back to you again with your...
Right, well, do you want to, while we're talking about the way forward with the legacy report, have a look at the appendix, which is on page, let me just get to it, page 20. Now that is just literally there's a lot of thought gone into it, but it's a starter for 10 on the framework and shape of the legacy report, so that we all know what we're talking about. It's reasonably straightforward to read it. I think one of the things that we noted in putting this together is that there are going to be different audiences for this report. It will, of course, be council itself and the community. The other audiences, we've talked about DIA and where they fit in. There's the sector, the local government sector, because there'll be learnings from this. And it also, given the timing, and you've said it yourself, Nobby, we're coming up to an election, so it will be reflective of how the council is feeling and be a useful tool for potential candidates. So we should be bearing these things in mind. Section 2, scene setting. Section 3, really what we did and when, so that's reasonably straightforward. Section 4, costs and risks are going to be an important component of it. You'll notice in there we've asked ourselves the questions, could we have done something differently? So we'll be open about that. Then there's a section there, final review and results. That's what we've just been talking about. In the narrative of the project report, we did say this might change a bit as we get into writing, so I'll just make that point. And then at the end, what are the learnings? So happy to take any other suggestions, comments, and I think as we're looking like coming back to having a workshop to look at this once we've got a draft to look at.
Thanks for that. Just one comment that I'd make, which is in your section 6 for you and Bruce, is whether part of our learning is, do we have flaws in the system, which is not the Invercargill system, but in the local government system, about how we control and deal with elected members' behaviour. And I've, on a personal level, had some time with some of the panel members on the local government future local government review, and raised the issue that the current procedure is to use codes of conduct. And Tim and I will probably be on the same page with to say that they can be nothing more than a wet bus ticket, to quote His Worship on one other occasion. So there needs to be some learning, I guess, or some thoughts going forward to the wider sector and maybe to central government about how do you not unmine democracy and freedom of speech, but at the same time have some mechanisms to control what is behaviour that goes beyond those boundaries. And so I just sort of flagged that, I get, and we're in an ideal position to maybe comment on that, because we've had ongoing issues in that area. But open it up for a discussion from anybody else that might want to comment on that project update report timeframe.
Perhaps I could jump in there, Nobby. Look,
Certainly.
I think that's your observations around the future for local government work program are really insightful. And Jane, I think you should add the future for local government in as one of your groups for the purpose of this. It does raise an interesting question, and as I was reflecting on this earlier, I was thinking about what are the learnings, and one of the challenges is that the learnings, we've got to be careful the learnings don't take away from the they can become quite objective, but I think there are some key questions that the council is in a unique position to contemplate through this report. What I've noted is a couple here. What are the indications of a serious problem within a council? How do you identify those issues early? And what options should be considered? And this goes to your question about could we have taken an alternative approach? What tools are available? And I think those learnings are going to be really important, particularly around the future for local government work, the codes of conduct work that is going on that the Local Government Commission has undertaken and is now being considered in the future for local government space. One of the things I've always said is that, one of my hopes for this PGG group and the journey that the council has been on is that it becomes a touchstone for other councils, and that the other councils will feel that they can come and speak with Invercargill and look at the learnings to be able to address their own problems. This could be an exemplar for New Zealand, so I think we should take that opportunity by actually diving a bit deeper into the question of what were the indicators and could we have done something differently early on. It's going to be hard because there are no right or wrong answers, but I think you guys are in a unique position to have some really good insights there.
And Richard, for your benefit, just to reinforce that, when we first started out on this journey with the Thompson report and got a little bit past that, I probably got about a dozen telephone calls from around the country from individual councillors who are in councils that are not high profile or dysfunctional, but have issues that are brewing very similar to what we had. And they were quite interested to know about how we were dealing with it. So you're quite right.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just one other thing to consider along those lines is just what role the letter from DIA actually played in making, forcing the council to actually make some decisions around or to acknowledge the situation, whether that is potentially, because that's outside, what we did was outside of any recommendation in the Local Government Act. It was a unique step that we took, and we took it for both Invercargill and Tauranga councils and saw quite a different response. So it would be interesting to consider as part of your learnings what role, if any, the department should play in calling out what it is seeing.
And that was part of the discussion I had with the future local government review panel. Some of their members was, in the future going forward, would it be the place of a piece of legislation with a government department to then flag issues with local councils, and how does that sit with democracy? Or do we go to something like an independent commissioner type role that might have some effort in that area that's separated away from government? I mean, there's a whole raft of issues, I guess. So it was interesting that you raised that as well.
I think Mr. Chair, the issue of teaching other councils how to behave is, I don't know, I feel shaky about that. I mean, even today, we had Councillor Soper taking one point of view, saying, no, this is not a farce, and you've got the Mayor saying this survey is a farce. And so, and I think it would be presumptuous of us to think we can go out into the great world and tell people how they should behave.
Well, let me reflect on that, because I don't think that's what Richard was saying. There's nobody around this table, I don't think, and anywhere else in the local government reform area that's suggesting that individual elected members should not have a voice. But it's how you express that voice and whether you personalise the comments that you make to the extent where the council becomes dysfunctional. And I guess that's part of our learning curve that, and if you went into yesterday's meeting as an example, the one about the museum, if we'd had that a year ago, I guess we would have had blood on the table, and the media would have been all over it, and there'd been massive headlines. And yet we had quite a controversial meeting yesterday, and it took a long time, and there were some impassioned speeches, and yet you look to the two media sources this morning, and there's no reporting because it wasn't seen as inflammatory, and we did business in a sensible way. So I guess that's one of the learnings that we should have from this, and others should learn from it as well. There is still a place for an outspoken elected member, but it's how you go about doing that. It's the way.
Well,
can I just comment there? There's a very big difference between what Richard said about the possibility of the report being a bit of an exemplar for other councils.
Sure.
There's a big difference between that and the concept of telling other councils what to do.
Sure.
The fact that there's a report that shows how this council reacted to a certain situation that might assist other councils in the way they were to deal with a similar situation is very different from trying to tell other councils what to do, or suggesting that every councillor around the table has got to have only one view.
Yeah, fully agree. Did you want to say something, Sir Tim? Was there any other comment about the framework that Jane and Bruce are going to use for, which is Appendix A, for the legacy report?
Oh, just a question. Has any thought been given to whether the report would be a majority report or a unanimous report?
Well, I think in good faith it would have to be a majority report, would be my view. I mean, you just heard Tim's view on some of this. Sir Tim has been opposed to the Thompson report all the way through. In more recent times, to his credit, the dialogue has been sensible, by my view, and I hate to be critiquing that, but so he still has the right to say, I don't agree. I don't agree with the outcome. So I think a majority would be helpful. Trying to extrude a unanimous one doesn't work, because we've had that before, where we had a unanimous support for the original Thompson report, and then within a day or two it all fell apart. I see some hands up, Richard.
Oh no, I was going to just comment on the fact that I think the key difference that Invercargill has faced is it's been able to take these steps without requiring any sort of special legislation or government intervention or anything like that. And so, but Councillor Sloper spoke to that. Well, that was the intention. This is looking as an exemplar. It's local government helping local government rather than central government telling others what to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jeff, did you have some further comment on that?
No, that's good.
Okay.
Nobby, if I can just say,
sure.
I think there's a really important point that Jeff raises, which is that actually the intention must be that this report is public, so it's going to have to be, clearly received by council, sure. and made public. That's why we would see the wisdom of sharing with you essentially a draft, if we can, for in April, so that there is a chance for credible thought and thinking before we then move into it. But I would agree with Jeff. I think Jeff's intention is that it needs to be accepted on a majority basis.
Yep. The problem we're going to have with all this is that it's very easy to take a simplistic view of what's happened, and I may seem oversensitive, but my view of the Thompson report is that we've got a problem and the mayor's to blame. And I just don't think that's the true story. I think there's a bigger narrative, and that is that a mayor is put in a difficult position because you are meant to represent an independent voice. And I think I shouldn't be punished for that or used as an example for that. And right the way through the Thompson report, it goes over and over again. I know, Nobby, you try and take a bit of responsibility for it, but you don't come under scrutiny by half compared with what the Mayor has been through.
So,
Nobby, I wonder if I
hang on,
I
will respond to that before I give Leslie and Lindsay an opportunity to bring forward that. What I would say in response to that, Your Worship, is that you are not the only one that was subject to criticism in the Thompson report. My reading was that I got as much as you, if not more, and Claire also had some as well. It's not about the criticism. It's about where you go on the path after the criticism. And I think one of the issues that should come out of the Invercargill report is what happens when you have an elected member in a key role like a mayor that is odds with the rest of the council, and I think that's that will be part of our learning as well, because again, under the Local Government Act, our hands are tied about how you resolve that, and I'm sure Councillor Pottinger over here would have something to say about that. So just for I think Leslie had a hand up first. You're on mute, Leslie.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair. What you've said has pretty much covered what I was going to say about the level of criticism in the original report, and I really don't think it's helpful to rehash the whole issue of the original report. We have moved on profoundly through a process that's been good for council, and let's keep that forward momentum going and await this report. And the influence this report could have in assisting other councils as a bit of an exemplar of how a council did deal with this in a positive way, without trying to once again relitigate the original history and who got criticised the most or who feels they were criticised the most, etc. It's just not helpful at the stage we're at. So, and the other thing, Mr. Chair, I'm very sorry, but I am going to have to depart to a District Health Board meeting at this stage. I do apologise.
Yeah, it's okay.
It won't be a problem for the next PGG meeting, but I do feel obliged to go to my other elected position at this stage.
Sure.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for your input. I'll just respond before I come to you, Lindsay, in relation to what Leslie had to say. I think it's important that when we go forward in our reports, that we go to the community, that we don't rehash the issues that were brought up. This is more about how we've dealt with them and whether the processes we used are a sense of learning for other councils as well. Because when I think back and I think about what got us the original Thompson report or the letter from the DIA, if I'm honest, we had some issues around the performance of the mayor on a personal level. We had a deputy mayor and myself that was doing a lot of damage in the background with the media, which was unhinging some of my colleagues, and there were relationship issues between the mayor and the chief executive, and between the deputy mayor and the chief executive. I can't think of much examples that would be much worse than that, if I really think about it. So it's not the issues, it's the way we've come forward for that should be the focus, and the focus for other people watching this. So Lindsay, you had your hand up.
Oh, look, thanks, Chair. I just wanted to encourage you back to the agenda and to not allow interventions, including, or especially from His Worship, that are tending to debate what the report might have in and what its focus might be, rather than getting a sign-off as to its content and the path forward. The time to do that is when you've got the draft report in front of a council workshop, not today.
And thanks for that feedback. But it's been my learned experience that if you try and close down that debate, it comes back later on. And I understand what you're saying. One of the issues I had for both Jane and for Bruce was the issue of the draft. Do we need a draft report to be considered? Because the draft by nature gives you a forewarning of what's coming, but it also gives you a bit of a benefit to tinker around the edges. And I'm wondering, given your experience, Bruce, and this is not feathering up to you, why we need that opportunity why we just don't have a final report from you and Jane that gets put on the table, and we decide what we do with it from there. So,
look, I probably would take your advice. I mean, I must confess, Nobby, my view is we should. and that's probably because an independent reporter
should have a draft.
We should have the draft.
Okay.
Is that in terms of natural justice, I am going to be dealing with in the report people's individual views. Okay. And it does affect the people in this room plus those that aren't. So in that sense, from a natural justice perspective, I think it probably is important that there is a chance to check that actually what we are reporting has been said to us is indeed what the person that said it thought it was. So that's just plain natural justice. So arguably that would be the case. I do hear your point. I think actually if I let Richard say something, Richard will probably say, well, here's a test of us from a governance perspective, which is actually we are going to get a report, independent in terms of Jane and I doing the work. Can we deal with it appropriately through normal channels to then be able to move to a decision on it? So look, I would argue better for it to be seen in draft by the council as a whole in the way that we have in the past so that we can clear it. So I'm just going to tease out something for you. I assume that presentation of the draft report would be in public excluded? Yes. My view, my view would be that we do it by way of workshop. Sure. And it would be a public excluded workshop because I'm sure we can work out the appropriate parts of Lagoima, but in essence, it is actually personal views being expressed and ones which affect individuals. We need to, first of all, have that chance to have that discussion before it definitely needs to be received and debated in public. Okay. And I'm just going to deflect over to Claire now, just to get a staff perspective on that, given your experience in this industry. On the possibility on the option of having a draft report with some workshop to deal with it before we actually formally table it and going forward, given that when we have these sorts of discussions, one of the issues that we have is we've got, and I'm one of them, probably the worst, some very noisy councillors around the table who tend to say a lot and others sit silent. And so just want to not allow that to overtake the process as well. In this situation, I would defer to the wishes of the report author, because it would be usual for the process of it getting to the table and getting accepted by the table would be based on the report author's preferences. Okay. I see. I'll take Claire, I'll take this on advice and just check. Jane and I can defer, but I think at this stage the preference for us is that we give councillors the chance to provide us with comment. The only question might be how we do that. If you don't want to have a set piece of a workshop, it still raises questions about how do we get that natural justice check on the report as a whole. Yeah. I will canvass the views around the table on that. Yeah. We've got people on Zoom there. Yeah, sorry, I'll come to them in a minute. Anybody else want to contribute to that? Yeah, Jane, see you there. Just before I go to you, Jane, my thinking around the not having the draft was not that we shouldn't have a draft, Bruce. I guess it was more around the time framing of putting some end to this, and I'm not being callous about that, but taking away the scaffolding I think is important because it gives, as you know, I'm not standing at the next election, but it gives the public an opportunity through some areas of pressure, be it rates reviews, be it annual plan, be it the election period, to see whether we've actually learnt what we say we've learnt and are standing up and acting in a more professional behaviour. And I think if we stretch this out too far, we encroach into that area. So, I mean, I'm more than happy to have a workshop, but I would like to think it to be sooner than later. Because I think there's some interest from councillors on what will come out of this, and I think the media would also be interested as well. Mr. Chair, I do have to express my concerns about the scaffolding being removed too early. Yep. I do think that the biggest challenge is embedding the behaviours, and I think that while the debate can take place in a more orderly manner now, there is still a matter of whether councillors are looking forward or harking back to the past. Yep. And I think it's really important that the council recognises that its opportunities are ahead of it, working with a very different organisation
to that which it had 18 months ago, and to continue to highlight failures rather than to look forward at the potential successes, and I think would be detrimental to staff wellbeing, would be detrimental to public confidence in the council. And I think that it's the scaffolding, as you refer to it, that has just supported councillors to keep that future focus.
So long as it's not seen as avoiding the issue or avoiding debate. I mean, as I said, I take a very simple view of this, and you, Mr. Chairman, are responsible for some of the difficulties we've had, and still having them. Just the loss of my PA, for example.
No, Sir Worship, yeah, I'll just call that short. Look, we're relitigating stuff that we've been over and over again. That's not what today's meeting's about. And I will call back to the agenda, as Lindsay has suggested in the past. You have mechanisms available to you to talk about your PA.
Mr. Chairman?
Yep.
Look, I just think for natural justice and for accuracy that the councillors should have access to a draft report, and otherwise you'll open up for criticism of the report at its final release.
Yep. That's fine. Yeah, Nigel.
Through you, Chair, just reiterating Claire's points and supporting them. When you take the scaffolding down, from my experience, it's relatively important you take it down piece by piece as opposed to all. The end result can be quite catastrophic. So I would support the fact that we just move through that process like any good scaffolder would, take it down piece by piece as we need to.
Yep. Okay, for Jane and for Bruce, I guess you've got a pretty good steer there.
Yeah, can I just check one thing, Nobby, from
Sure.
your perspective? You sort of got latched on to timing. Are you are you wanting a short time between the draft and when it hits the council table? I mean, at the moment, it's
I think both.
We're sort of in the monthly routine of
Sure.
the PGG, which is April for a workshop, May it gets tabled. But are you asking for a compression?
Well, my personal view is I think a compression of that would be helpful as opposed to doing it in that time frame. Because again, if I was outside council and I had an interest in council, I'd want to know that that members around this table, and a significant amount of them are standing again, can perform in a professional way, and that have not been propped up by scaffolding all the way through to the election. I think there's some degree of wanting to know that post the end of this work, that councillors around this table, including His Worship, and we've seen some examples today of him going back to issues, can work in a way that would be expected of the ratepayers.
But I only go back to those issues because they haven't been resolved, in my view.
Well, Your Worship, I don't want to relitigate that, but you were part of a unanimous vote to accept the Thompson report. The Thompson report we've worked through. You've had any amount of opportunity to talk about issues around cell phones, IT, and PA support, and I'm not going to relitigate that. It's the view of most of your colleagues, and certainly on the advice from the Chief Executive, that the level of support that you have in the PA area is suitable. And so if you want to make that an election issue, you're more than welcome to do that. But for this purpose going forward, we're just going back to square one if we keep relitigating that. So Jane, any other issues you have on
Look, I think they've been covered. The one, Jeff picked up the one I was going to add. Errors of fact are really important.
Yep.
And this has been an 18-month process, so that's another good reason for having a workshop. And also, just to remind the group that this report tells a story which is a lot more than just the Thompson review.
Sure.
It covers a whole lot of other stuff. So that was all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Yes, and just as a final reflection for both you and Bruce, I think it's an interesting process that we feel in some ways that we've achieved what we set out to achieve, where in fact we haven't. You can see by His Worship's comments today that he is still back very much in the early stages of this process, relitigating issues. And I could do, and Claire could probably do the exactly same thing, but we have to move on. So, my final reflection on that. Jane, you have the wider issues on the project update report to discuss now.
Yes, there's only a couple there. I think if we go back to number 6, future reporting against outcomes, you'll see we've added a couple at the end. Now this table I feel is integral to going forward. We don't spend a lot of time on it, but again, when we hark back to the beginning, we said it was really important to measure what we're doing. This is an important table, and I wouldn't like to see it disappearing. However, having said that, there's it could probably go to risk and assurance when this group finishes its work. So I don't know if anybody wants to discuss anything on it, but it's something that I think Council should retain even when this project winds down.
So I'd have some comments for you there, Jane, and for Bruce as well. It seems to me that we have some unresolved issues around professional development, governance, media training, te reo, tihanga Maori. I think we're getting close enough to the election now that some councillors will not be committed to those sessions because they're not mandatory going forward. There's at least 3 or 4 people that are not standing at the next election. So one of the issues for the group going forward is, I mean, I've had years and years of tihanga Maori and governance training through the government sector. Why would I come to these sort of sessions again? I ask myself, would I come to be supportive of the process? As an ex-training manager, I can tell you that brings people into an environment that are there for the wrong reasons. So I expressed yesterday at the chairs meeting that I thought some of these developmental issues that we've still got in professional development should be targeted post the next election for incoming people. But some of my colleagues felt that we should keep the process going now. So just flagging that for you, I guess. And it's open for discussion about where we go with it on that. The other issue is the issue of the supporting the mayor work stream group. So I'll come to that as a separate exercise once I've opened up the discussion for where we go to on the professional development side of things and whether there are opposing views.
So it's Jeff here.
Yeah,
Chairman. Look, I still see for the PGG 3 roles, and that's the legacy report, professional development, not so much pre-triennial, but I think that the planning should start later this year so that the professional development on the new councillors arriving, plus the existing councillors, starts in the new year, not 6 months later after the triennial. And I think the other one is the councillor induction program. I just don't think when we were back at the workshops, that work hasn't really been developed, or we haven't been exposed to it at PGG. But I would have thought that a conversation, at least with councillors in terms of the recent 3, including the 2 Maori representatives, about what they would found worked and what didn't in terms of the induction, so that a good induction program started right away after the triennial for the new councillors. Is it quite 3 critical roles, I think, left for PGG.
Okay. So I'll open that discussion of the professional development outcomes up for others to input if you wish. Oh, I see a hand up on Zoom somewhere. Richard. Richard, yes, thank you.
That would be me. So just speaking to Jeff's point about the induction program and the framework, and this is probably a wider topic for the PGG to think about, but we've got to think about the future role of the project governance group and what that might look like. I mean, we were set up for a very specific role what we're talking about now is actually moving into something that's quite different. And perhaps there is a place for some sort of oversight group in the future if that's what the council allows. But I just think we need to make sure that we're clear on what the governance group's role is in terms of finishing off this project before we get into other things. That said, totally support Jeff's observation that planning should be underway in the council for training programs and for induction, because that's going to be critical.
Yeah, thanks for that input. And that's been my view as well, that I see that this group has a finite legacy, and I see the issue of induction and professional development going way beyond that, and it should be business as usual.
They were both parts that originated out of the Thompson report.
Sure, I understand.
I think it is the responsibility of PGG to make sure they land somewhere outside of PGG.
Yep.
I agree. Good point, Jeff.
Yep, I've got that.
Mr. Chair, I wonder if that's an opportunity to say that alongside the draft report by Bruce and Jane, there should be a review of the two Thompson reports and a confirmation or identification of all of the pieces of work, so that you can be satisfied that you've done the lot, or this is where the outstanding remains.
Yeah, that's good. That's good advice. Yep, I've got that. Thank you. Did you get that, Bruce and Jane?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep, thank you. And the last issue for me on your report, Jane, was the issue of the supporting the mayor group, which was initially supporting the mayor and chief executive group. And I just don't see where this group goes. And I'm going to ask Councillor Skelt shortly to give some input into that. It seems as though we've made some links with the mayor on a more informal basis. And if that's to be maintained, that's fine. But this group just seems to be stuck in the mud with no progress forward on a formal basis. Because in my view, from what I've observed, the issues are still the relitigation of the lack of support for the mayor, and that we just keep going back over that in that group. And so that group, from my knowledge, hasn't met for quite some time, and it doesn't have any tangible outcomes sitting alongside it at the moment. So I'm happy to give the floor to you, Councillor Skelt, and give us an update on where you think this should be. You're in at the coalface.
Thank you, Chair. I guess there's two issues. One is the formality of the group, which was set up, which Councillor Abbott chaired, Councillor Arnold, myself, and Councillor Lewis. So the formality we haven't quite got there in the sense of the continuing on, as you've outlined, Nobby. But the informal process, just put in recently, from my perspective, and Councillor Lewis, who can speak to it himself, just a big thank you first and foremost to Liz and her team, and to Michael for his support. And whilst it was extremely informal, the meeting we had with the mayor and the subsequent follow-up, from my perception, and the mayor can speak for himself quite clearly, but from a demeanour and a process, it seems to be certainly have worked and been helpful. I've checked in informally back with Liz and with Michael, very informally and briefly, around the processes, and it seems to be a really good process. Obviously, one of the issues that fell out of where the mayor was at was the ability of one around the EA or PA / in the hard copy of material. That was being provided up to that point, but there's been more emphasis going forward. Thank you, Michael, Liz, for around that. And I think His Worship has appreciated that. From my perspective around council meetings and informal meetings, His Worship seems to be, and don't take this as an offence, Your Worship, but more engaged and through process. So that's been a really positive, in my opinion. We have a very informal process, and Councillor Lewis can speak in a moment, but very happy to continue on the informal process to support the mayor where we can, both around the meeting structure and the social structure, should he require it. So when we left the meeting, we thought we agreed informally that we would have a catch up every month in general terms. So that's just about where we are now. So very happy to do that again. But maybe Councillor Lewis, you might like to give your impression of the meeting and where we are at.
So just before we get to that, Nigel, because I'm going to ask Graham and ask His Worship as well.
Yep.
So this really sits outside the framework of what we're dealing with in the working together framework, doesn't it? It's something. It's
evolved with the fact that perhaps as a result of Councillor Abbott perhaps not having the opportunity and being off site more so than in,
Yep.
So it's rolled into an informal process just because of the situation we're currently in.
Yep.
So that would be a fair comment.
So if we were as PG to close down that work stream and do no further action on it, your group and your interface with His Worship could continue on.
I can only speak for myself, but obviously very happy to continue on. But
yep. Graham.
Thank you, Chair. I would not have put my hand up unless I was prepared to persevere with help for His Worship where he needed it.
Yep.
After the meeting that Councillor Skelton and I had with His Worship, I felt that we had achieved something. His Worship seemed to be quite happy and grateful for the things we'd set in motion, for the time frame during the daytimes during the week that His Worship would have access to PA and perhaps extra coaching, so to speak, preparation for meetings. And His Worship was very grateful and thanked us. Subsequently, I was led to believe, but I wasn't at the Chair's meeting, of course, that His Worship was not too happy about it. So I'm quite interested to hear what His Worship has got to say about that, because I thought we'd set in place some processes which were going to help greatly His Worship and the Council in general for the demeanour that we would have around the Council, and would deal with some of the problems that have been raised, obviously in Thompson report, etc., which His Worship has alluded to today, perhaps. So, Chair, I was very happy with the way the meeting went. Very happy to keep my hand up to help His Worship where wanted, and to be involved with our little subgroup. So I'm quite interested to know what His Worship has to feel about it.
Sure.
Because without his input and positivity, it's a waste of time.
Sure.
I've got a private life also, and I'd quite like to make sure His Worship is happy we're on the right track to help him if he feels he needs help.
I'll give him the opportunity shortly to tell you that.
That's really all.
Just as a reflection on what was raised at the Chairs Group, the Chairs Group, the feedback we got from the Mayor was not a reflection on your input. It was more a re-litigation back onto the on the issues of wanting extended hours for the PA and other issues. So that was my take on that, and that sort of surried the water a little bit about what we were trying to achieve with him. So
the analogy towards scaffolding has been made today, and I actually feel it's a wee bit like ice skating. On the fringe of a pond, the ice is quite firm, but when you start to skate out in the middle of it, it gets thinner, and the more people that are in the middle of the pond are more likely to be compromised by very icy water.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe scaffolding is not the right phrase for using. Your Worship, would you?
There used to be a scaffolding hand, but
scaffolding is very important, and as a concrete contractor for 12 years, I did a lot of scaffolding work, and if you take it away before the concrete's set, you'll have a tragedy on your hands. And I had that in Australia, where the boss took the scaffolding down and the roof collapsed and everyone got killed except me. So I learned salutary lessons, and I've learned a lesson from this exercise too, and that is that it's sorry, I've got
I'll help you out there, Claire. It's, Your Worship, it's probably the first time in a long time I've heard you agree with the Chief Executive, who a few moments ago suggested that we shouldn't take the scaffolding away too early. So that was really positive. But I guess what your colleagues were asking for here was how you felt about their input in an informal way as opposed to a formal way. The meeting they've originally had with you, and whether you'd like that to continue on as we lead up to the next election.
Well, the jury's still out as far as I'm concerned, because of the results I'm looking at, rather than and they have taught me that, because I had to look at what my operation was, and as a mayor, and it was, I thought, if I can get one victory or one success story out of it, it would be the issue of the PA, because you said it, I only needed 12 hours a week from a PA, and not 40 hours like everyone else has. And it taught me the value of staff support. You just can't seem to get anything done.
So, Your Worship, I've got to move this agenda item along, otherwise we'll be here forever and a day, because we're really relitigating what we worked over many, many times about your support. And I guess I'd be interested to hear from your two colleagues again what their response is to what you've just said, because I guess, and they can correct me if I've got this wrong, this informal support group was not there to add weight to your claims for extra PA hours or to have a new cell phone or laptop training or whatever else that's raised. It was there to, I guess, support you in an emotional way, I guess, or so that you could work through the period that we have up to the next election. It's concerning for me, I guess, as the chair of this group, that you say that the jury's out on your perspective on the efforts that two of your colleagues have put in. And so I'll give them a right to respond to that. Graham, if you would like to lead that.
Thank you, Chair. I don't expect to be presented with a timesheet for a PA and the need for it. But we discussed at our little informal meeting. I say informal because it was documented and recorded. We discussed that if the need was there, we could probably discuss with the governance team to provide that extra help. The initial help that we arranged, and I use the word loosely, what was discussed was to make sure there was a time frame for His Worship to have the PA in the mornings, to present, to go over agendas, go over any other issues that they could be discussed. Whether or not one needs 12 hours or 40 hours, we didn't discuss at length, but it was indicated possibly that 12 hours would be enough initially to go over any problems. But the problems, if they were identified by His Worship, were to be, it was suggested he could report back to us, perhaps as first instance, to discuss with that. We still kept it informally, but I haven't heard any response back from His Worship since then. So I really can't see how I can progress unless I find out more details about his immediate needs, and I probably will leave it there. Scaffolding, I've got illusions of scaffolding. I had a scaffolding in hand at one stage. There's one gentleman turned up in the field and he started to swing a pole, and I suggested he didn't swing that pole because he would have hit the power lines right beside it. So there's always a bright spark in the group, and I don't consider myself a bright spark, but I am concerned about His Worship continued aspects of discussions about not having support when we are offering it. But we need some proper documentation so we can comply with some of the wishes, I think. I'm there to help if my help is still wanted. Thanks.
Nigel.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I can only echo Councillor Lewis's concept of what the meeting was about, and I thought we put in some really good structures through and learning more, which was really important for us as councillors. A little bit more about the time frames that His Worship had and the need, and it was about need, obviously. And we put in some really good, I believe, some really good stepping stones for His Worship and the crew around time frames and around content and around meeting structure and material for meetings. So we left in a really positive mood regarding that. I have spoken to His Worship a couple of times on how it's going, and every indication to me in general terms was, apart from the access to a full-time PA EA, everything else was in good shape in general terms. So I'm a little bit surprised this morning by we're relitigating that particular point. But if His Worship is feeling comfortable and doesn't want the support in an informal way, then that's fine. We're not offended by that at all. We just go on our way, but the offer is still there, Your Worship, because we think it's really important. You're an integral part of this team, and I talk about the team of 13. So we are there to assist in any shape or form, but we're not there to relitigate and spend time on those issues that have been clearly identified, and again through process that we were given, and we went through all those processes through that meeting and time frame. So if that's changed, then that's fine. We accept that and we move on. So I'm really keen to get some definite answer today, because as our chair has indicated, we're all busy people, and we can devote our time to other things if need be. So whether it's formal or informal, we just need a real clear direction this morning, if we can, within the next 2 minutes. Otherwise, the jury will be out and it'll stay out.
Chair, I wonder if I could intervene and make a suggestion.
Certainly.
Well, I think we can give, we being PGG, can actually give that direction. It's quite challenging to get that level of commitment from His Worship, especially in the context of a meeting like today. So just a brief recap. My recollection is that the original workstream outcomes for this working group were signed off at council level, including the resourcing question that has come up again today, and I'm suggesting let's not relitigate that. I think when the person who's the subject of the offer of support is equivocating or uncertain about their needs, it's still incumbent on the organisation to consider whether, notwithstanding all of those things, it puts support in place. And my advice would be that the PGG does mandate or does ask the informal group to maintain its presence and be available to support the Mayor's general wellbeing should he request it. I think if we do anything else, we run the risk of not being responsive to the situation that we're facing. So my suggestion in short is that we note that the original workstream outcomes have been met, and that we, PGG, asks the informal group to maintain a presence in the organisation in support of His Worship the Mayor should he require it.
Yeah, thanks for that input. I will put that to group in a minute, Lindsay. I guess one of the things that I'm keen to clarify on this, and I think you've helped do that, is that it was interesting His Worship used the words, I want a victory. And the victory is the PA issue, because if I'm brutally honest, I think as we go to the election, His Worship will throw up the lack of a PA, the lack of IT training, the lack of a cell phone, and so on, for reasons why he doesn't perform at a level that you would normally expect of a mayor. And that's a horrible question to have to deal with, but it's there for us. And the sooner we resolve the issue of this workstream group and put it to bed, in my view, and then offer alternative support, as you've suggested, the sooner we step away from that debate. And it has a life of its own, but we don't get embroiled in it, because it will come back to us again as a group. And so I don't want to be sitting at this table 6 months from now in the lead up to election justifying why the mayor has 12 hours as opposed to 40 hours. We're way past that. I think that was good advice, Lindsay, but I will open it up to the rest of the group to because the issue could be coming back in your report, Bruce and Jane. The suggestion, as Claire has put, that this the future of this group could be indicated in your report should now lapse as not completing all its original tasks, but it's got as far as it can get. So this work stream group is not perfect and hasn't been for some time, and your recommendation could then be that the colleagues here who are still engaged in an informal way around the mayor's well-being continue, being mindful that we wouldn't expect of the group for them to relitigate the things that go beyond the well-being, which are more the physical things that are around the office, potentially. I don't know. But I will open it up for discussion around the table. I guess, Graham and Nigel, that sits well with you, both?
Just for you, Chair, through Lindsay's comments around the clarification of support in the sense of at the Mayor's request, or from that informal group being proactive and, for example, saying we'll catch up every month, but as opposed to just at the Mayor's request. Could you clarify that for me, what your thoughts were? Before he does that, Lindsay and I have discussed this before, and I think, as he has alluded, it's incumbent upon an organisation, if they have
a member of the organisation struggling a little bit to provide support. You don't wait for somebody struggling to ask for help. So, and I'm not suggesting this in a negative way, but if you had somebody that had mental health issues, for argument's sake, you don't expect a person that's not thinking clearly to come to you and say, I need some help. If you can see it, you have a moral obligation. And so that's what he's implying, I think. Am I correct in that, Lindsay?
Oh, thanks, Chair and Nigel. Yeah, I don't think this is something you can script. I think it's a balance, Nigel, between availability and responsiveness, and having your antenna tuned in, on a weekly basis, if not slightly more frequently, as to where you might need to intervene. But you can't write a job description for that, or at least I couldn't. So it does rely on intuition and, just the humanness, I guess, that goes with relationships.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Graham?
I'm slightly confused. In my profession in the health system, after I was a scaffold in hand, I have learnt to recognise problems. But how do we deal with a problem that somebody perhaps doesn't appreciate that there may be a problem? It's almost patronising to go up to somebody and say, I think you have a problem. But we have Thompson reports and things like that which have identified various problems around the council, and we've been litigating those, we've been dealing with those problems, and I was hoping that we've got far enough down the track to be quite happy with our results over the last wee while, with the DIA, the external advisors, etc. And I think it's been fantastic, our progress. But this I hate the term elephant in the room situation, it keeps rising up. The request for 40 hours of PA, and perhaps we shouldn't litigate it right now, discuss it at great lengths now, but can we justify the 40 hours? We have suggested, system has suggested 12 hours of PA work with the addition of extra hours where it is needed. It hasn't been restricted to that 10, 12 hours, as far as I understand. At our meeting, we discussed with His Worship that if he needed more, perhaps just to discuss it with us, and we will look into extra PA help, PRN as necessary help. I hesitate to see why somebody should sit in an office for 40 hours, a PA, sit there in an office waiting for work. That's not, the economics of that just don't stack up for me. When they could be doing useful work around the council and other aspects of it. But if it's needed, it's needed. We have to quantify and qualify that those sort of hours are needed. It's not an examination on His Worship, it's just a fact of life. If I had staff that, if I was short of staff in my former profession, I would increase the staff levels. But I want to make sure they were actually gainfully employed and the need was there. I'm not here to criticise His Worship. I'm here to try and help His Worship. And I think that has to be taken in the right attitude, Tim, that I've volunteered to help you. And if you need help, please let us know. It is an informal situation. We don't have control over the whole governance structure, but we can perhaps recommend it. If we're not informed of the hours that you need for PA, and that seems to be one of the major sticking points, please let us know. I respect you so much, and over the years I have. When I first met you, well before I was involved with council, I respected you all those years. And I still do. I want to help you. I don't want you to suffer.
You can go if you need to go.
I'm probably going off the track there, but I think that my message is getting through. I respect His Worship very much, and if I can help him, I certainly will.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. And I'll just really briefly clarify for you some of the issues that you said. At a recent chairs meeting, we've had this issue about the PA again. And so one of the issues I asked Your Worship was, you've got 12 hours, but if you needed extra hours, Claire's more than happy to have that on an informal basis. I said to him, what do you need the extra work for? And I got two responses. One is, all other mayors have got 40 hours. I said, well, that's not a need. That's just being like everybody else. What do you need the extra hours for that person to actually do? I didn't get a response to that. And the second response I got was, I'd like her to be in the office when I come in unannounced. I said, that's fine, but what's she going to do when you come in unannounced that she's not doing now? And I didn't get a response to that either. So it was very much around other mayors have 40 hours, therefore I should have 40 hours. And so we've left it at that because we just can't afford to keep relitigating. So, I mean, I appreciate the support that you're both giving, and I hope that informal stuff continues, because it is okay to sidle up to somebody and say, are you okay? It doesn't need to be critiquing them, but I think giving clear steer for Bruce and Jane, that could be something that comes out of the report that you bring forward, that this group needs, the formal side of this group needs to lapse now, has achieved as much as it can do. As Claire said, that we've got other issues to consider as well about the professional development, other things. So if your report can cover that, that would be great. Jane, anything else you want to raise?
Just one final thing, Nobby, page 15, item 7.
Yep.
There's been a lot of discussion about what's left for this group to do. Now, the draft work plan doesn't cover the sort of standing items, which are the budget, the risk, and the project outcomes. These key items were the sort of strategic bits of it. So for April and May, what we have discussed is, rather than discussing the outcome of the March review, we would have a workshop ahead of the handover legacy report, or a meeting. Can we just be clear about what it is you wish us to do going forward with regard to a workshop or a meeting? Or you've talked a bit about scaffolding coming away.
I wish I hadn't used that term now.
Yeah, and there has been good discussion on what's still left to do.
Yeah. So
in April, the strategic matter would be the legacy report.
Sure.
I would have thought. Is that right, Bruce? Are we on the right track?
Well, I think if I can,
Yeah,
agree. I think
be,
in short, it's actually what does the PGG need to do in April? Clearly, the big issue is going to have to be the legacy report.
Of course.
But whether it's got anything else is another question.
That's right. Yeah, and then we finalise it in May. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the aim at the moment, and with some question from Nobby about compression of that.
And note that it's finalised the handover legacy report. So as we've discussed, everything we've been doing would go somewhere. It wouldn't just stop. So just a bit of clarity around that from the group itself, would be good.
And I'll open that up shortly. And as I've said previously, some compression of that would be helpful. And one of the rationales for that, as Councillor, as Graham has said, we've made some significant progress through the last 18 months. Council performs, by my view, much better than it used to, and we've all had roles to play in that. I don't want to get our legacy report caught up in the electioneering as we lead up to the next election, because I'll put money on that the Mayor will not agree to the legacy report, the general outcomes. There'll be some dissension there, and I don't want that to become a political football at the time that we release it through the media. We will need to carefully strategise how we do that, allowing for His Worship to be able to be an opposing view. The lesson for learning was when we unanimously agreed to the Thompson report, and 2 days later we got broadsided by a media fiasco. So I don't want to repeat of that if we can avoid it. So helping with that time frame, Bruce, would be good, I think.
Sorry, I didn't catch that, Mr. Chair. What was...
Oh, I just quickly repeat it. I just said that I would like us to get the legacy report through its draft process and out into the media and away to the DIA before we get too close to the elections. That we'll need to have some comm strategy around that, because we may have dissenting voices around the table, including your own, about the outcome of the report, given that it touches on issues of leadership. And so I don't want that to be sitting up there too close to the election where it becomes a political football. I think, as Graham has said, it takes away from the gains that we've made. It's not perfect where we are, but it's certainly vastly improved on where we were at 18 months ago. And so I don't want to lose that in the electioneering, because you can sit around this council table now and see potential mayoral candidates lining up. They are taking positions of points of difference, and I don't want that report to be a casualty of that sort of approach as we lead into the election.
So really, the question, Nobby, is actually, rather than process, when does it need to be out by?
Yep.
So the point that I think Jane and I were making at the start is that we have just pinned it to the trajectory of PGG meetings, which would be the legacy report would be available through final clearance of the PGG in May for presumably the May council meeting. I think if I can put words in your mouth, you're saying too late, Bruce. Is that right?
That's my view.
Yeah.
And you've suggested to counter that we could have some workshops to deal with the draft that don't have to be tied into this time frame.
No, look, it doesn't.
I don't know how easy that is for you and Jane.
For natural justice and accuracy, yes, we need to do something. Yeah, so I'm open to really your guidance and lead.
Well, I'd like us to be able to put that final report out earlier than May. That's my personal view. And that doesn't make it April, because they're just 4 weeks apart. But if we can bring that back a little bit, I think that would be helpful. We've got some other contentious issues coming up around May too, around rate strikes and the annual plan and stuff like that. And I just don't want to get caught up in the debate that might be in that arena.
I think in fairness to, might I say, Jane, who does the heavy lifting on this, I have to be very careful on this one and give all credit to Jane.
She wasn't doing any heavy lifting when she pulled the boat out.
We will need that period through April to put together, because actually I like all the points that have been made today, but it actually does have a wee bit of weight to it, which we need to be aware of. The timing between getting the draft actually done and its adoption is much more flexible than probably the time needed, essentially the month that's needed to get that report properly.
Well, that's what I was trying to seek your guidance on, because I don't think there needs to be much time between a draft workshop and the release, but it's...
If you recall in some of those hard, terrifying days when we started this project, we turned them around in 24 hours.
Yeah. But what I'm hearing from you is the issue of getting the draft report right.
Yes, that's most critical for us.
Mr. Chair, I would just point out that the draft annual plan is proposed to be adopted on the 22nd of March, so 3 weeks. And April has quite a bit of disruption because of Easter and Anzac Day. So I just urge you to think about those. School holidays is in there for 2 weeks.
Oh, right, of course, yes.
Yeah, basically you get to 14 April and then for a lot of people there'll be no business until after Anzac.
Okay, thanks.
Could I ask,
I'll leave that
with your leave, that you allow Jane and I to talk with Claire about actually how we fit this in time scale. Critical message as early as possible. And particularly shortening the time between review of the draft and its publication.
Sure, that'd be great. Just leave it in your hands. Thanks for that.
Have we got a quorum, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I'm not sure about that. Can you help me with that, Claire?
I believe so. I will double check, but I believe so. Half the number of members we've lost. Nigel and Leslie, but both of the EAs are members, as is myself. I'm satisfied that you'd have.
Thanks for that. Yes, we do have a quorum, Claire. I'm sorry, Tim.
You're not actually a formal meeting under a formal committee under the governance structure in any event.
Thank you. Do you have some concerns about that, Your Worship?
No, if we're not allowed to have meeting to continue with the lack of forum.
Well, as the Chief Executive advised, we're not bound by those types of rules, and we've got a significant number of members here that are the 2 EAs, myself. Are you in it, Bruce? I think you are. Claire, Graham, Tim. So any amount of number. So for me, that's
there is plenty.
Where I end. Anything else you want to add to that, Jane?
No.
No.
Thank you.
Any other general business around the table?
Well, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to round it off by saying I appreciate the help that Graham and the others have made to, and Nigel, to get through this consultation type of process. And I don't like to sound disruptive or but it's just that I felt that points just had to be made, and I'm still not. I think if we went to any other council, or city council anyway around New Zealand, you wouldn't find that 12-hour limitation was necessary.
So, Your Worship, I'm not going to go back over the 12-hour litigation. We've discussed it numerous times today, and it's been discussed to death previously. And what I will reflect is that I think you have colleagues that are prepared to support you on a personal level. I appreciate that you've now said that you appreciate that, so I'll certainly let Councillor Skelton know as well. And it would be my expectation that at the next meeting we will close down the work stream group as having run its course. I still am resistant to the suggestion by you, which continues on, that the lack of support, be it from Claire's area or from support from your colleagues, is the reason why we have some degree of leadership issues within this council. I think you are blessed with the time that you've been in as a mayor in this council and other councils, and you're blessed that the framework that we sit within allows you to continue to perform at the level you're at. And so I'll just leave that at that. And if we have no other issues, I'll recommend that we close the meeting. And thank you for those that have zoomed in.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll call you.
Yep. And we're done. Downstairs.